So a friend of mine sent me this video by Jordan Peterson, who throughout this video we will only refer to as Daddy, talking about philosopher Michel Foucault. And after watching it,
I've read a fair bit of Foucault.
I knew I had to make a reaction video. I watched this video and just started raging, going through the books I have and notes I've taken. My friend was partially inspired by Daddy to get involved in philosophy, and he knows that I'm kind of a Foucault stan, so he wanted to get my opinion. Alright, I got Lord Ganesha to help us out. We got our hammer. Let's do this. The video my friend sent me is called Daddy, Mental Illness, a Social Construct? Foucault? By the YouTube page Bite Size Philosophy, and the description says, psychology professor Dr. Daddy comments on Foucault's critique of mental health institutions. But this video is actually a snippet of a lecture that Daddy gave in 2016. It's up on Daddy's page, and this video is called Maps of Meanings Part 1, Osirus, Set, Isis, and Horus. Maps of Meaning is Daddy's main work, perhaps his magnum opus. So, Daddy only talks about Foucault at the beginning of this video, so we're just gonna focus on that. Here we go!
I've been reading this book recently, which the title of I can't remember, unfortunately, but I'll tell it to you after class. It's a critique of certain lines of left-wing ideological thinking, including the existential thought of people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Foucault. And
did he just say Foucault was a existentialist? Oh, this is not looking good. I got a bad feeling about this. First off, Foucault was not an existentialist. Sartre and Foucault were philosophically opposed to each other's thought. Both Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir criticized Foucault's thought as bourgeois, with Sartre writing in a review about Foucault's book The Order of Things that Foucault was, quote, the last barricade of the bourgeoisie, to which Foucault replied by saying, poor bourgeoisie! If they needed me as a barricade, then they've already lost power.
One of the most trenchant critiques of Sartre, because he well, then there's Foucault, who I have no respect for, by the way. I think I've read a fair bit of Foucault, and I think everything he says is obvious. So, for example, he criticizes the idea of mental illness as a social construct. It's well, yeah. Obviously, I mean, it's not like psychiatrists and psychologists and mental health professionals who are relatively well informed haven't known about that for the last 60 years. I mean, it might be a revelation to people who don't notice that psychiatry, for example, is something like a compromise between the patient, biology, and the social world.
If we look at the history of psychology, psychology was originally a metaphysical term, specifically referring to the metaphysics of the human. It was Christianity, which Daddy is very enamored with Judeo-Christian values, that posited that all humans have a soul which exists independently of all social influences. This continued with Descartes all the way to Kant, and then Hegel, and even phenomenology, which was still very influential when Foucault was a lad and coming of age. So the idea that it was obvious that mental illness and the field of psychology were not social constructions, or were not influenced by social constructions, is simply not the case. Even today, we still have Christian psychologists that still rely on the Christian concept of an ahistorical, asocial soul to explain mental illness. Foucault says in an interview entitled Truth and Power, which I'll link in the description so that you can go look with your eyeballs. Foucault says when he was studying in the 1950s, and he started pointing out how sciences like psychology and medicine were profoundly enmeshed in social structures, quote, what rather threw me at the time was the fact that the question I was posing totally failed to interest those to whom I addressed it. They regarded it as a problem which was politically unimportant and epistemologically vulgar.
Psychiatric ailments often have a biological tilt, but the way they manifest themselves in society is clearly conditioned in very intense ways by the particular conditions obtaining at the point that the person who has that biological predisposition exists. Even whether or not that's pathological can be tilted one way or another by cultural norms.
And then, of course, when you're dealing with issues like insurance payment and treatment and hospitalization, obviously you're pulling in all sorts of systems that are by no means purely scientific. But I don't find it a particularly useful critique. It's obvious as far as I'm concerned. And the other thing that Foucault did, I mean, I think this is the typical, especially the French intellectuals' typical sleight of hand once Marxism became, once you were no longer able to call yourself a committed Marxist. Because a committed Marxism had led to unbelievable brutality, on a scale that had never probably,
I think, had never been experienced in the entire history of the planet, at least in terms of its reach and duration. You didn't get to call yourself a Marxist anymore, although there were still people, and you still see them saying, well, that wasn't real Marxism, which I think is a cop-out of staggering proportions. It usually means, well, if I was the person running the country, that wouldn't have happened. That's the logic behind it. They didn't put the principles into practice properly. It's like, yeah, well, lots of people put the damn principles into practice, and the same thing happened everywhere. So at some point,
you have to kind of wonder if there's something wrong with the principles. Anyways, what Foucault did was take the Marxist presupposition that everything could be boiled down to economics and economic power, and translated it into the idea that everything just boiled down to power. And that the reason that we have institutions is to include and to exclude, and that the institutions always run for the benefit of those at the top. It's like, well, yeah, that's a little bit true, but it's a scientist would look at that and say, yeah, well, probably, power dynamics in a functioning economic and political system maybe account for 10% of the variance. So, for example, if you have say you want to go to a school.
I've read a fair bit of Foucault.
Well, if your parents went to the school, you're more likely to get in, but you're not that much more likely to get in, and you still have to be, roughly speaking, what happens is that if you have a pretty decent, high school GPA, and you do very well on the SATs, and you have some other talents of some sort, because that's also necessary, then they might pick you over someone else who's roughly equally qualified if you have a familial history of attendance at the school. So obviously you get an advantage, but it's not the kind of advantage
that accounts for the entirety of how the system is structured. It's an advantage. Well, you can say, well, that's not fair. It's like, yeah, okay, fair enough. Most systems are certainly not 100% either fair or just. Definitely not. But, instead of comparing them to utopia, you might compare them to another system, which is the only reasonable way to do it. It's like everything looks terrible when you compare it to the best thing you can possibly imagine. But the best thing you can possibly imagine is it's an empty fiction, because it's so devoid of detailed content that you can't use it as a guide to reality. Now, I mean, the idea that things could be better has its roots in some sense in a broad-scale utopian project, and I believe that things could be better, but that doesn't mean that when you're doing an analysis of a complex system, you get to compare it to an ideological utopia and then describe all the reasons that it's bad. It's not appropriate to do that. It's too simplistic. You're not going to do anything to actually address the problems that the system has if you take that approach.
And then, of course, pure utopian thinking is extraordinarily dangerous, because if you think that your way of molding society into some ultimate state of perfection is headed towards some ultimate state of perfection, then you can justify absolutely anything you do right now on the basis of the fact that things are going to improve so radically in the future. And that means any of your behaviors are excused. The end is worth it. Well,
if someone says that, you have to kind of wonder what they're actually planning. Excuse me. What they're actually planning to do. So, well, what's the issue? Well, the issue is that the same critic with regards to Foucault, he said, it's basically the same thing, that Foucault criticized a variety of profound institutions, sexual institutions, say, like marriage, and then institutions of power like prisons, and institutions of mental health, the whole institutional framework. He criticized them on the basis of power and exclusion. And
so Daddy says that Foucault critiques these profound institutions. But Daddy never says what critique means for Foucault. But he seems to imply that critique means negation. According to Daddy, Foucault critiques psychiatry as socially constructed, and therefore mental illness isn't real. Again, Foucault never says this anywhere.
But, Foucault also made the presupposition. The problem with that presupposition is that everything is about something else, is that it's almost impossible to see how it can't be applied to Foucault himself. So you'd have to ask, if you were a student of Foucault, what power aims
Discipline me, Dad.
analyze everything in terms of power. And I actually think with Foucault it's pretty obvious. So, but it's a game that never goes anywhere. Okay, so I thought about that a lot. It's like, is there any system that you can develop? And this is partly why I'm talking to you about this.
Wow, that's a lot. Lot to deconstruct there. Yikes. The main Foucault text that people usually refer to when talking about mental illness is The History of Madness, which is a really massive work. Most people have only read the abridged version, Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason, which I actually don't have a copy of. But the abridged version was approved by Foucault as an accurate portrayal of his thought. Now, Dadi says the social constructions in psychiatry are obvious to anyone, and have been obvious for 60 years. But is he talking about 60 years from 2016, which would have been the 1960s, or 60 years before Foucault published this book in 1961? Okay, so Dadi immediately lists a series of social influences in psychiatry, none of which Foucault even focuses on. Foucault's focus in The History of Madness is on the discursive formations about madness, insanity, unreason, irrationality. How do statements about these concepts develop and acquire scientific legitimacy, and more importantly, scientific authority? How, throughout modernity, has society understood what madness and unreason were? What those experiences were like? How has this changed throughout history? So here's just one of the many examples from, again, this 600-page book, which Foucault focuses on. Think about all the various stereotypes that we have about mental illness. This is historically determined. In the mid-17th century in France, Foucault describes what he calls the Great Confinement. This was a period when the poor, infirmed, and unruly in society were all institutionalized together. If you were a vagabond, i.e. somebody without roots, which typically meant that you were somebody that was suspicious, unemployed, a beggar, a criminal, had a mental illness, or were considered a sexual deviant, or had a venereal disease, any type of social disorder or unreason, anything that disrupted the social order or the reason that governed society could and were institutionalized altogether. At one point in Paris, 1 out of every 100 people had been institutionalized in this way. And this lasted 150 years until the 19th century. And this is the key point here. The reason for the Great Confinement had nothing to do with medicine or mental health. These spaces of confinement were quasi-judicial in nature, and the ideology guiding these institutions was a Christian and capitalist morality. The above-mentioned sorts of folks were viewed as sinful or evil. Foucault points out that if morality is the viewpoint in dealing with mental illness, you are far more likely to address mental abnormalities or deviancy with punishment. The cure for a moral failing is punishment, not treatment. The Great Confinement did have a negative function of exclusion, but it also had a positive function by providing unreason with a type of coherence or unity. If you were to go look at these places of confinement, you would see kind of a uniform world of unreason, so that the qualities of any one of these types became the qualities of the other. It is why homosexuality and transsexuality were considered mental disorders by the medical community and still are by lots of conservative religious groups. It's these same conservative religious groups that oppose any type of historical, psychological, or medical education on LGBTQ plus experiences, believe that education on this topic is explicitly for the purpose of grooming children or engaging in criminal acts of pedophilia. So, for them, merely being LGBTQ+, you're already involved in a type of criminal conspiracy they believe will directly lead to criminal acts. Or having a mental illness. Even to this day, the behavior that is expressed in these illnesses are often criminalized, where people that are suffering a mental health crisis end up being incarcerated. People with mental illnesses are seen as inherently dangerous or out of control. There are still communities that view mental illness as a sin or a punishment by God. We still have exorcisms performed to this day. And Daddy doesn't even seem interested in any of these historical facts or how they continue to influence the way that we view mental illness to this day.
I don't find it a particularly useful critique. It's obvious.
And to finish up this point, I'll quote Foucault. In the Truth and Power interview, he says, quote, "It is a question of what governs statements, and the way in which they govern each other so as to constitute a set of propositions which are scientifically acceptable, and hence capable of being verified or falsified by scientific procedures. In short, there is a problem of the regime, the politics of the scientific statement. At this level, it's not so much a matter of knowing what external power imposes itself on science, as of what effects of power circulate among scientific statements, what constitutes, as it were, their internal regime of power, and how and why at certain moments that regime undergoes a global modification." Back to Daddy. Next, he calls Foucault a Marxist. Now, Foucault was a member of the Communist Party from 1950 to 1952, which is a very short period of time. Foucault would later say that Marxism exists in 19th century thought like a fish in water. That is, it ceases to breathe anywhere else. Then, Daddy, I don't know if he's still talking about Foucault, says that people try to wiggle their way out of dealing with things like the Gulag in the USSR by saying, well, that's not real socialism, you didn't do it right.
I think is a cop-out of staggering proportions.
Here's what Foucault actually said about this type of thinking. This is from an interview Foucault gave in 1977 entitled Powers and Strategies. And Foucault was responding to the fact that many leftists were using his writings on the prison system, discipline, and punishment to try and ignore the problem of the Gulag by just saying all modern societies have this. This is what Foucault says, and I'm quoting the words that came out of his brain parts. The Gulag question, on the other hand, involves a political choice. There are those who pose it and those who don't. Refusing to question the Gulag on the basis of the texts of Marx and Lenin, or to ask oneself how, through what error, deviation, misunderstanding, or distortion of speculation or practice, their theory could have been portrayed to such a degree. On the contrary, it means questioning all these theoretical texts, however old, from the standpoint of the reality of the Gulag. Rather than of searching in those texts for a condemnation in advance of the Gulag, it is a matter of asking what in those texts could have made the Gulag possible, what might even now continue to justify it, and what makes its intolerable truth still accepted today. The Gulag question must be posed not in terms of error, reduction of the problem to one of theory, but in terms of reality, rejecting the universalizing dissolution of the problem into the denunciation of every possible form of internment. The Gulag is not a question to be posed for any and every country. It has to be posed for every socialist country, insofar as none of these since 1917 has managed to function without a more or less developed Gulag system. It seems to me that we must insist on the specificity of the Gulag question, against all theoretical reductionisms, which makes the Gulag an error already to be read in the text, against all historicist reductionisms, which makes the Gulag a conjectural effort which can be isolated in terms of its causes, against all utopian dissociations, which would set it with pseudo-socialism in opposition to socialism itself, against all universalizing dissolutions into the general form of internment. Foucault is complaining about the exact same thing that Daddy is.
I've read a fair bit of Foucault.
Maybe Daddy's one of those post-modern neo-marxists I keep hearing about. Is that true, Daddy? Are you a pomo, no-mo, acadamino?
Next, Daddy says Foucault, who is a secret Marxist based on quotes that Daddy never provides, views everything as power based on the Marxist conception of power. So 2 things here. Foucault does view everything based on power, but he believes this as like a type of physics, in the sense that the universe is made up of forces that relate to each other. 2, Foucault does not conceive power in the Marxist sense, which is essentially understanding it as purely negative, the power to take away or oppress. Now, Foucault does recognize that power can function in a negative way, but he also believes that it functions in a positive way too. I did a whole video on this that you should definitely check out, but here's a quote on what he means by power in the same Power or Strategies interview from 1977. Foucault says, "It seems to me that power is always already there, that one is never outside it, that there are no margins for those who break with the system to gamble in. But this does not entail the necessity of accepting an inescapable form of domination, or an absolute privilege on the side of the law. To say that one can never be outside power does not mean that one is trapped and condemned to defeat no matter what. I would suggest rather, but these are hypotheses which will need exploring, 1. That power is coextensive with the social body. There are no spaces of primal liberty between the meshes of its network. 2. The relations of power are interwoven with other kinds of relations, production, kinship, family, sexuality, for which they play at once a conditioning and a conditioned role. 3. That these relations don't take the sole form of prohibition and punishment, but are of multiple forms. 4. That their interconnections delineate general conditions of domination, and this domination is organized into a more or less coherent and unitary strategic form. That dispersed, heteromorphous, localized procedures of power are adapted, reinforced, and transformed by these global strategies, all this being accompanied by numerous phenomena of inertia, displacement, and resistance. Hence, one should not assume a massive and primal condition of domination, a binary structure with dominators on one side and dominated on the other, but rather a multiform production of relations of domination, which are partially susceptible of integration into overall strategies. 5. The power relations do indeed serve, but not at all because they are in the service of an economic interest taken as primary, rather because they are capable of being utilized in strategies. 6. That there are no relations of power without resistances. The latter are all the more real and effective because they are formed right at the point where relations of power are exercised. Resistance to power does not have to come from elsewhere to be real, nor is it inexorably frustrated through being the compatriot of power. It exists all the more by being in the same space as power. Hence, like power, resistance is multiple and can be integrated in global strategies." Next, Dadi accuses Foucault of believing in utopias and comparing institutions to that. Foucault doesn't believe in utopias. Utopias are based on ought statements, moral statements on what ought to be. Foucault doesn't really make ought statements. Following Nietzsche, he's trying to philosophize beyond good and evil. He doesn't analyze institutions and say, these are bad. He just analyzes how institutions are formed and says, this is the way it is. Now then Daddy says that he believes in a type of generalized utopianism, where there is a progression of things getting better. Foucault doesn't believe in that at all. This is an Enlightenment idea that the search for truth is like a continuous progressive line from ignorance to knowledge, onwards and upwards towards inevitable progress. That's a modern belief, and Foucault is postmodern in rejecting it. Here's a quote from Foucault in the same Truth and Power interview. "It seemed to me that in certain empirical forms of knowledge, like biology, political economy, psychiatry, medicine, etc., the rhythm of transformation doesn't follow the smooth, continuous schemas of development which are normally accepted. The great biological image of a progressive maturation of science still underpins a good many historical analyses. It does not seem to me to be pertinent to history. In a science like medicine, for example, up to the end of the 18th century, one had a certain type of discourse whose gradual transformation within a period of 25 or 30 years broke not only with the true propositions, which it had hitherto been possible to formulate, but also more profoundly with the ways of speaking and seeing, the whole ensemble of practices which served as supports for medical knowledge. These are not simply new discoveries. There is a whole new regime in discourse and forms of knowledge, and all this happens in the space of a few years. This is something which is undeniable once one has looked at the text with sufficient attention. I pose the question, how is it that at certain moments and in certain orders of knowledge there are these sudden takeoffs, these hastenings of evolution, these transformations which fail to correspond to the calm, continuous image that is normally accredited?" And that's basically the end of Daddy's comments on Foucault in this specific video, which again is titled Osiris, Set, Isis, and Horus. Daddy actually doesn't get to the subject till like 45 minutes in. I feel really bad for his students that like they had to sit through that for 45 minutes before they could actually get to like the subject matter. I did look through a copy of Maps of Meaning, and he doesn't mention Foucault once, so I don't know why he brought him up in this lecture about his book.
I've read a fair bit of Foucault.
This statement, if it is true, and I highly doubt it is, means he's never seriously engaged with any of Foucault's works at all. I had thought about doing a video on Daddy a long time ago, but others like Cuck Philosophy and ContraPoints have already done really amazing videos, pretty much proving that Daddy has no idea what either postmodernism or Marxism is, which are two separate, distinct things. They are not the same thing. But shout out to Eternalized for sending me this video and inspiring me to make this reaction. If you do want a video explaining Foucault's conception of mental illness and psychology, etc., you should watch this video by Then and Now. They do a really good job of explaining it. I might do a video on Daddy's engagement with Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is someone that Daddy actually quotes, and it might be worth looking at whether Daddy understands Nietzsche, or at least the way that he understands Nietzsche. Leave a comment if that's a video that you would like to see. Thank you to all my patrons, and I will see you next time. Bye!
And my room isn't fucking clean.